She ran into her first love at a cafe and discovered he was now a mafia boss. The espresso machine hissed loudly, a sharp burst of steam that cut through the low hum of conversation filling the Bean Street Cafe. Lena Carter wiped a sheen of perspiration from her forehead with the back of her wrist, her other hand deftly securing the lid on a takeaway cup. It was barely 9 in the morning, and the line already snaked past the pastry display case, a twisting river of impatient commuters, tired students, and locals seeking shelter from the gray, drizzling sky of Harborview, 31 years old. That number had been floating in her mind lately, usually accompanied by a vague sense of panic she tried to suppress. Lena slid the cup across the counter with a practiced smile, thanking the customer before turning to the next order. Her hands moved with muscle memory, grinding beans and frothing milk, but her mind was elsewhere. It was drifting toward the small, battered sketchbook tucked beneath the register. During her 10-minute break earlier, she had managed to sketch the outline of the old clock tower visible through the front window, capturing the way the rain slicked its brick facade. It was her dream to illustrate full time, to trade the smell of burnt roast and sanitizing fluid for the scent of graphite and ink. But dreams did not pay the rent on her studio apartment, and they certainly did not pay for the expensive art supplies she hoarded like treasures. So, she poured lattes and smiled at strangers. Tessa, her coworker and self-appointed guardian of Lena's non-existent love life, nudged her hip against Lena's as they maneuvered around each other in the narrow workspace behind the counter. "You are doing it again," Tessa murmured, pitching her voice low so the customers would not hear. She grabbed a clean towel and started wiping down the steam wand. "You have that 1,000-yard stare." "Who are you thinking about? The mysterious brooding artist who does not exist?" Lena rolled her eyes, though a flush of heat crept up her neck. "I am thinking about the rent, Tessa, and the fact that we are out of almond milk." "You need a date," Tessa countered, unbothered by Lena's deflection. "A real date, not a coffee with a sketchbook. When was the last time you let a man buy you dinner? And do not tell me it was that graphic designer from 3 years ago." Lena turned away to grab a fresh carton of milk from the under-counter fridge. "I am happy," she lied, the words tasting like chalk. "I have my art. I have my job. I do not need the complication." But as she straightened up, her mind betrayed her. It did not go to a graphic designer. It went, as it always did in her quietest moments, to a boy with dark curls and a crooked grin. Marco DeLuca. They had been 18. It had been the summer of fireflies and humidity, of sitting on the hood of his beat-up sedan, watching the city lights of Harborview twinkle like diamonds they would never be able to afford. He had been her first everything, her first love, her first heartbreak, and the first person to make her believe she was special. And then, the week after graduation, he had vanished. No letter, no phone call, just an empty locker and a rumor that he had left town. For more than 10 years, the silence had been a wound that refused to close completely. The bell above the cafe door chimed, a cheerful sound that usually signaled just another caffeine-deprived soul entering their orbit. But this time, the atmospheric shift in the room was instant. The chatter at the tables near the entrance died down. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with a sudden, static tension. Lena looked up from the register, her "Can I help you?" dying on her lips. 3 men had walked in. The 2 on the flanks were large, their presence aggressive even in stillness. They wore thick leather jackets that creaked as they moved, their eyes scanning the room not like customers looking for a table, but like predators assessing a threat. They stood with a disciplined, terrifying stillness that made the hair on Lena's arms stand up. But it was the man in the center who sucked the oxygen out of the room. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that was tailored to perfection, the fabric hugging broad shoulders and a lean, powerful torso. He wore dark sunglasses that hid his eyes, and his dark hair was cut shorter than she remembered, styled with severe precision. He looked expensive. He looked dangerous. He looked like Marco. Lena froze, her hand hovering over the register screen. It could not be. Her Marco wore grease-stained t-shirts and jeans with holes in the knees. Her Marco laughed with his whole body. This man stood with the stillness of a statue, radiating a cold, controlled authority that made the cafe feel suddenly very small. The man reached up and removed his sunglasses, folding them slowly with one hand. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. A painful, sharp intake of air. The eyes were the same, dark, intense, framed by thick lashes, but the warmth she remembered, the boyish mischief, was gone. In its place was a flat, guarded coldness that sent a shiver racing down her spine. He was older now, his face leaner, the angles of his jaw sharper. A faint, thin scar ran along the line of his jaw on the left side, a jagged interruption to his handsome features. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the pastry case before lifting to meet hers. The world narrowed down to a single point. The hiss of the machine, the rain against the glass, the murmur of the customers, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only him. Their eyes locked across the counter. For a second, his mask slipped. The cold indifference cracked, revealing a flash of raw shock. His pupils dilated, and he took a half step forward, as if pulled by an invisible string. "Lena," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, richer, wrapped in a texture of gravel and silk. It was a voice that commanded attention, yet he spoke her name softly, like a prayer or a curse. Lena realized her hands were trembling. She clasped them together on the counter to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. "Marco," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You are back." One of the men in leather jackets stepped closer to Marco, murmuring something into his ear, his eyes never leaving the other customers. Marco lifted a hand, a sharp, dismissive gesture that silenced the bodyguard instantly. He did not look away from Lena. "I am back," Marco said. He moved closer to the counter, leaning one hand on the polished wood. The expensive watch on his wrist glinted under the overhead lights. "How are you?" "Lena, it has been a long time. 10 years, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "It has been more than 10 years. Marco." A shadow passed over his face. Something like regret. But it was gone so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. "I know," he said. "I know exactly how long it has been." The air between them was thick, suffocating with unasked questions. "Where did you go? Why did you leave me? Who are you now?" But they were in a coffee shop, with a line of people behind him and Tessa watching with wide, confused eyes from the espresso machine. They could not have that conversation here. They could only play the parts of strangers catching up. "What can I get for you?" Lena asked, forcing her professional mask back into place, though it felt fragile, ready to shatter. Marco stared at her for a long moment, his gaze tracing the curve of her face, the messy bun on top of her head, the stray curl falling over her forehead. "Black coffee," he said. "Dark roast. Nothing else." "Right," Lena said, her fingers fumbling slightly as she punched the order into the screen. "That will be $3. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. He placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change." "I cannot keep it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lena turned to the machine to pour the coffee, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel his eyes on her back. It was a physical sensation, a weight of heat and intensity that made her skin prickle. She was acutely aware of every movement she made, the way she reached for the cup, the way she turned the tap. "You are still drawing," he said. Lena jumped slightly, splashing a drop of hot coffee onto her hand. She hissed in pain, quickly wiping it on her apron. She turned around to find him looking at the corner of her sketchbook, which was peeking out from under the register. "Yes," she said, flushing. "Just part-time. I work here mostly." "You were always the talented one," Marco said. His voice dropped lower, an intimate rumble that seemed to vibrate through the counter between them. "I still remember that sketch you did of the old pier, the one you gave me for my birthday." The memory hit her like a physical blow. She had spent weeks on that drawing. She had thought he had thrown it away when he left. "I'm surprised you remember that. she said, her voice tight. "I remember everything." "Lena," Marco said. He leaned in slightly, resting his forearms on the counter. The movement brought him into her personal space, bringing with it the scent of him. Rain, expensive tobacco, and a woodsy cologne that smelled of dark forests and secrets. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. "Careful," he murmured, nodding toward the fresh cup she was holding. "Your hands are shaking." "You surprised me," Lena defended, though her cheeks burned hotter. "You cannot just walk in here after a decade looking like that and expect me to be calm." A corner of his mouth quirked up. It was a ghost of his old smile, the one that used to make her knees weak. "Like what?" he teased softly. "Like you own the place," she shot back, a spark of her old fire returning. Marco's expression sobered. "I do not own this place," he said, his voice cryptic. "Not yet." He reached out for the cup. As she extended her hand to give it to him, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric. A jolt of energy shot up her arm, settling deep in her chest. It wasn't just a brush of skin. It was intentional. His fingers lingered on hers, warm and rough, for a heartbeat. He did not take the cup. He just held her hand, his thumb sweeping once, gently over her knuckles. Lena stopped breathing. She looked up at him, startled. Marco's eyes were dark, swirling with a storm of emotions she could not decipher. There was regret there, vast and deep, but there was also something else, a possessive warmth, a hunger that looked dangerous. It was the look of a man seeing water after walking through a desert, debating whether he deserved to drink. "Thank you, Lena," he said, his voice rough. He pulled his hand away slowly, taking the cup. The loss of his touch left her skin feeling cold. He turned and walked toward the door, his movements fluid and confident. The two men in leather jackets fell into step behind him immediately, forming a protective phalanx. As the door opened, Lena saw a sleek black SUV idling at the curb, its windows tinted pitch black. A driver hopped out to open the rear door for Marco. Lena stood frozen behind the counter, her heart racing. The cafe slowly returned to life, the noise level rising as the imposing figures left. A man in a business suit who had been waiting near the pickup counter leaned toward his companion. He lowered his voice, but Lena's senses were dialed up so high she heard every word. "Did you see who that was?" the man whispered, his eyes wide. "That was Marco DeLuca, the DeLuca family." "The mob guy?" his companion hissed back. "Keep your voice down," the first man said nervously. "They say he runs half the city's underground now. Gambling, protection, everything. He's the new head of the family since the old man got sick. You do not want to mess with him." The name hit Lena like a slap across the face. DeLuca family, mob guy, underground. The pieces slammed together in her mind, the expensive suit, the scar, the bodyguards, the way the room had terrified itself into silence. The rumors she had seen on the news about a rising crime syndicate in Harborview, she had never paid attention to the names. Marco was not just a guy who had left town to find himself. He was a mafia boss. Lena stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Tessa was saying something to her, asking if she was okay, but Lena could only hear the rushing of blood in her ears. The boy who had once held her hand while they walked home from school, the boy who had promised to protect her from the neighborhood bullies, was now one of the most dangerous men in the city. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Lena moved like a robot, pouring drinks and taking money, but her mind was replaying that moment of contact over and over, the rough warmth of his thumb on her hand, the darkness in his eyes. By the time closing came, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Harborview slick and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. Lena locked the front door of the cafe, her hands still trembling slightly. She said goodnight to Tessa, who gave her a worried look but did not push, and turned to walk toward her apartment. Her route took her through the quiet, tree-lined streets of the older district. Usually, she loved this walk. It was her time to decompress, to think about art and colors. Tonight, the shadows stretched long and menacing. Every car engine made her jump. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. She turned the corner onto her street, her apartment building looming ahead, and then she stopped. Under the pool of yellow light cast by the lamppost near her building entrance, a figure was waiting. He was leaning against the post, his hands in his pockets. The bodyguards were nowhere to be seen, but a black sedan was parked half a block down, its engine running silently. Marco pushed himself off the lamppost as she approached. He had taken off the suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms marked with faint scars. He looked less like a kingpin now and more like the man she might have imagined he would become. Weary, solid, real. Lena clutched her purse strap tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should run. She should turn around and go back to Tessa's. She knew what he was now, but she kept walking until she was only a few feet away. "You are stalking me," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I am ensuring you got home safely," Marco said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the command he had wielded in the cafe. "This neighborhood, it is not as safe as it used to be." "And whose fault is that?" Lena asked sharply. "Yours?" Marco flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of his jaw, but she saw it. "I do not hurt civilians. Lena, you know that." "I do not know anything about you," she said. "I do not know the man in the suit. I do not know the man with the bodyguards. And I certainly do not know the man who left me without a word when we were 18. Marco looked down at the pavement, exhaling a long breath that puffed white in the chill night air. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded heavy, dragged up from somewhere deep. "I never wanted to hurt you. Leaving. It was the only way to keep you out of it." "Out of what?" Lena demanded. "Your family business?" He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "Yes. You could have told me," she whispered, the anger giving way to the old, aching hurt. "You could have said goodbye. If I had said goodbye, I would not have been able to leave," Marco said simply. "And if I had stayed, you would have been destroyed." He took a step closer. The scent of him, that woodsy cologne mixed with the sharp smell of the night, wrapped around her. It was familiar and foreign all at once. He radiated a physical heat that beckoned her. "I just wanted to see you," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I needed to see that you were okay, that you were happy." "I was fine," Lena said, her voice trembling. "I was fine until this morning." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You spilled the milk," he said softly. "You always were clumsy when you were nervous." "I was not nervous," she lied. "I was terrified." "You do not have to be afraid of me," Marco said. He raised a hand, as if to touch her cheek, but stopped inches away. His hand hovered there, trembling slightly. "Never of me. Lena." Lena stared at his hand. It was large, capable of violence, yet hesitating with such gentleness. She remembered the way those hands used to hold hers. She remembered the safety she had once felt in his arms. For a moment, the years melted away. She felt a magnetic pull, a desire to close the gap between them, to press her face against his chest and ask him why the world had to be so complicated. She wanted to lean into his warmth. She wanted to know the taste of the man he had become. But then the image of the bodyguards flashed in her mind, the whispers in the cafe, the DeLuca guy. He was a criminal. He was dangerous. And he had broken her heart once already. Lena took a step back. Moving out of his reach, Marco's hand dropped to his side, his fingers curling into a fist. "I cannot do this, Marco," she said, her voice steadying. "You cannot just show up and expect... Whatever this is, you made your choice 10 years ago. I had no choice," he said, his voice straining with suppressed emotion. "We all have choices," Lena said. She stepped around him, moving toward her building door. She punched in the code with shaking fingers, the buzzer sounding loud in the quiet street. She pulled the door open and turned back to look at him. Marco was standing under the streetlight, watching her. His expression was a warring mix of frustration and hunger. He looked like a man who had found his salvation, but knew he was too damned to touch it. "Go home, Marco," she said softly. "I am home," he said, his eyes burning into hers. Lena swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it painful. She stepped inside and let the heavy door swing shut between them. Through the glass. She watched him for a moment longer. He did not move. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the city night, watching her until she turned and walked up the stairs. Leaving him alone in the darkness, he commanded. The glow of the laptop screen was harsh in the dim light of Lena's living room, casting long, spectral shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she could not bring herself to move. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, scrolling through search results that felt less like news and more like an indictment. She had typed DeLuca Family Harborview into the search bar, expecting perhaps a few business listings or maybe a local scandal from years ago. Instead, she had opened a Pandora's box of headlines, police reports, and investigative journalism pieces that painted a picture of a world she had only ever seen in movies. Harborview Underground, the rise of the DeLuca Empire. Illegal gambling rings linked to waterfront warehouses, police suspect DeLuca family in high-profile smuggling operation. And there, in the center of it all, was Marco. Lena clicked on an image from a charity gala taken 6 months ago. Marco was wearing a tuxedo, holding a glass of champagne, looking every inch the legitimate businessman. But the article beneath the photo told a different story. It speculated on his rapid ascent to power following his father's stroke, detailing allegations of racketeering and intimidation. The article called him the Prince of the Harbor, a title that dripped with irony and menace. Lena shut the laptop with a snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to erase the image of the man in the tuxedo. It was impossible to reconcile him with the boy who used to help her carry her art supplies. The boy who had once sat on her fire escape and told her that he was afraid of turning into his father. He had not just turned into his father, he had surpassed him. The realization sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. The boy she had mourned for 10 years, the ghost she had compared every other man to, had become a monster. And worse. He had walked into her cafe yesterday and looked at her with eyes that still held the warmth of that 18-year-old boy. Going to work the next day felt like walking into a trap. Every time the door chime rang, Lena's head snapped up, her heart performing a nervous flutter in her chest. Tessa noticed her jumpiness immediately. "You look like you were waiting for a bomb to go off," Tessa commented, dumping a bag of coffee beans into the hopper. "Is this about the tall, dark, and dangerous guy from yesterday?" "He's not dangerous," Lena said automatically, then stopped. She did not know that. According to the internet, he was very dangerous. I do not know what it is about." "Well, whatever it is," Tessa said, nodding toward the front window. "It is back." Lena froze. Through the glass, she saw him. Marco was standing on the sidewalk, looking at the cafe entrance. He was alone this time. No leather-jacketed flankers, no imposing wall of muscle. He was dressed in a navy sweater and dark jeans, looking deceptively normal, though the way he held himself, shoulders back, chin high, still set him apart from the weary morning crowd. He pushed the door open and walked in. The atmosphere in the cafe did not shift as violently as it had the day before, perhaps because he was alone, or perhaps because he was making a conscious effort to dial back the intensity. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring the few customers scattered at the tables. "Lena," he said. His voice was lower today, rougher, as if he hadn't slept. "Marco," she replied, gripping a rag tightly in her hands to hide the tremor. "I am working." "I see that," he said. He glanced at the clock on the wall. "Your break is in 10 minutes. I remember the schedule. Tessa usually takes the morning rush. You take the mid-morning breather." Lena stared at him. "You have been watching the cafe?" "I notice things," he corrected softly. 10 minutes. I will wait." He did not order anything. He simply moved to a small, two-top table in the far corner, sitting with his back to the wall so he could see the entire room. It was a tactical choice, she realized with a shiver. He never stopped calculating. When the 10 minutes were up, Lena untied her apron with reluctant fingers. She felt like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff. She signaled to Tessa, who gave her a thumbs up and a curious look, before walking around the counter. Marco stood up immediately as she approached. "Not here," he said before she could speak. His tone was soft, but there was an edge of command in it, a steel core wrapped in velvet. It was the voice of a man who was used to people obeying him without question. Lena's chest tightened with a mix of defiance and anxiety. "Where, then?" "The alley," he said. "It is private." He led the way, opening the back door for her. The alley behind Bean Street Cafe was a narrow strip of cobblestone and brick, shaded by the looming buildings on either side. It smelled of damp earth and old coffee grounds. It was quiet here, the noise of the city muffled by the brick walls. Marco turned to face her, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind them. In the cool shade, his features looked sharper, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced. "I know you looked me up," he said. It was not a question. Lena crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive barrier. It is hard not to when half the city is whispering your name. Is it true? Marco stayed silent for a long moment. He reached into his pocket, as if looking for a cigarette, then stopped himself. "Do not believe everything you read in the papers. Lena, they like to sell fear. Is it true?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Are you the head of the family? Are you running gambling rings, smuggling?" "I am the head of the family," Marco admitted, his voice flat. "My father." He could not handle it anymore. Someone had to step in. "So you stepped in?" Lena asked, incredulity coloring her tone. "You disappeared for a decade to become this? You told me you wanted to be an architect. Marco. You wanted to build things, not break them." "I tried," he said. The pain in his voice was sudden and visceral, cracking the calm facade he wore. He took a step toward her, his hands open at his sides. "Why do you think I left, Lena? I left to get away from him. I went to Chicago. I worked construction. I tried to be a nobody." "Then why are you back?" "Because you do not just walk away from this life," Marco said bitterly. "They found me. They threatened the only things I cared about, my mother, my little cousin. You." The word hung in the air between them. "You... Do not put this on me," Lena whispered, stepping back. "Do not dare tell me you became a crime boss to protect me." "I came back to keep the violence contained," Marco insisted, his intensity flaring. "Before I took over, the streets were chaos. Civilians were getting hurt. I put a stop to that. I keep the business separate. I keep the violence away from people who have nothing to do with it." "It is still violence, Marco," Lena shouted, the emotions of the last 24 hours boiling over. "It is still crime, and you are in the middle of it." She felt tears stinging her eyes, hot and sudden. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" she asked, her voice breaking. "When you left? I thought you were dead. For a year. Every time the phone rang, I thought it was the police telling me they had found your body in a ditch somewhere. I cried myself to sleep for months. Marco, I mourned you." Marco's expression shattered. The guarded mask dissolved into raw, bleeding guilt. He looked at her with such desperate sorrow that it took the breath from her lungs. "I am sorry," he rasped. "God, Lena, I'm so sorry." He moved closer, invading her space, but she did not back away this time. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised his hand, reaching for her face. His fingers hovered inches from her cheek, trembling slightly. He looked at his own hand as if it were covered in something indelible, something that would stain her if he made contact. He hesitated, caught between the overwhelming need to touch her and the conviction that he did not deserve to. A sudden gust of wind swept down the alley, catching a loose strand of Lena's hair and whipping it across her eyes. The movement broke Marco's paralysis. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently catch the wayward lock of hair. His fingers were calloused, but incredibly tender as he tucked the strand behind her ear. The touch was electric. His thumb grazed her temple, a slow, reverent caress that sent a shiver racing down her spine. He did not pull away. His hand lingered against the side of her face, cupping her jaw. Lena stopped breathing. She looked up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Marco's gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. The air between them grew thick, charged with 10 years of unspoken longing. He leaned in. It was a gradual, magnetic pull. Lena felt herself swaying toward him, drawn by the gravity of his presence. She could smell the scent of him, soap and rain and that underlying darkness that was uniquely his. They were breathing the same air, their faces inches apart. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. For a heartbeat, she thought he was going to kiss her. Part of her wanted him to. Part of her wanted to close the distance and erase the last decade with the pressure of his mouth on hers. But then the image of the headlines flashed in her mind. Mafia boss. Smuggling. Threats. She turned her head sharply to the side. Marco froze. His lips brushed her cheek. A ghost of a kiss, an accident of proximity, before he pulled back. The loss of his warmth was instant and jarring. "I cannot," Lena whispered, staring at the brick wall. "I cannot do this." Marco stepped back, giving her space. When she looked at him, his face was a mask of stoic resignation, but his eyes were burning with frustration. "I understand," he said quietly. "I have to get back to work," Lena said, though the thought of pouring coffee seemed absurd now. "Lena," Marco said as she reached for the door handle. She paused. "Let me drive you home tonight." "No," she said immediately. "I can walk. I always walk." "Not tonight," he said. "Please, just for safety." "I'm perfectly safe," Lena insisted. "I do not need your protection. Marco, it is not just about protection," he said, his voice dropping. "It is about attention. Being seen with me yesterday. People talk. Eyes are on you now. I need to make sure you get home without anyone bothering you, just until the chatter dies down." "I will be fine," she said stubbornly and pulling the door open. "Goodbye, Marco." She went back to work, but her hands shook for the rest of the afternoon. She kept glancing out the window, expecting to see him, but the sidewalk was empty. By the time the sun set and they flipped the sign to closed, Lena was exhausted. Her nerves were frayed wires. She said goodbye to Tessa and stepped out into the cool evening air. The street was quieter than usual. Lena adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started walking. She'd only gone a block when she noticed it. A gray sedan was parked across the street, its engine idling low. As she walked, the car inched forward, matching her pace. The windows were tinted too dark to see the driver. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. She quickened her pace. The car sped up slightly. Paranoia, fueled by Marco's warning and the articles she had read, clawed at her throat. Was it the police? Was it a rival gang? Was it just some creep? She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling, when a sleek black car pulled up smoothly alongside her on the near curb. The passenger window rolled down. It was Marco. "Get in," he said. It was not a request. Lena looked at the gray sedan across the street. It had stopped now, idling ominously. She looked back at Marco. His face was set in grim lines, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Unease pricked at the back of her neck. The instinct for self-preservation overrode her pride. She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat of Marco's car. The interior was a different world. It smelled of rich leather and the faint trace of his cologne. The silence was absolute as the door thudded shut, sealing them in. "Seatbelt," Marco murmured as he put the car in gear. He pulled away from the curb. Lena watched in the side mirror. The gray sedan did not follow. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice small in the quiet cabin. "I do not know," Marco said, his jaw tight. "Could be nobody. Could be someone curious. I am not taking the chance." They drove in silence through the city. The streetlights streaked across the windshield, painting rhythmic bars of light and shadow across Marco's face. He drove with an effortless competence, one hand relaxed on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. The atmosphere in the car was charged, heavy with the words they had not said in the alley. Every time he shifted gears, his arm brushed against the fabric of her coat, The small, enclosed space amplified his presence until it was the only thing Lena could feel. She rested her hand on the center console, needing to anchor herself. A moment later, Marco shifted his hand from the gear stick, letting it rest on the console as well. Their fingers brushed. It was a light contact, barely a graze, but Lena felt heat flood her face. She should move her hand. She knew she should, but she didn't. Marco did not pull away either. Slowly, deliberately. His hand relaxed, his pinky finger hooked slightly around hers. Then, his thumb moved, stroking across her knuckles in a rhythmic, soothing motion. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, one that spoke of ownership and familiarity. It was the way he used to hold her hand when they watched movies, absent-minded and constant. Lena stared straight ahead at the road, her breath catching in her throat. The simple touch was undoing her. It was a bridge across the 10 years of silence, a reminder that despite the suits and the scars, his hand still knew the shape of hers. As they turned onto her street, Marco slowly withdrew his hand, placing it back on the wheel. The loss of contact left a cold ache in her fingers. He pulled up to the curb outside her apartment building but did not unlock the doors. He killed the engine, plunging them into stillness. Lena reached for the door handle, but she did not pull it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the ride." "Lena," Marco said. He turned in his seat to face her. The shadows of the car hid his eyes, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. "I never stopped," he murmured. His voice was low, rough, with a restrained emotion that sounded like gravel grinding together. "Not for a single day. I never stopped thinking about you." Lena turned to look at him. "Marco." "Seeing you again," he continued, leaning closer. "It feels like a second chance I know I do not deserve. I am not a good man. Lena, I have done things that would make you hate me." "I could never hate you," Lena whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "You should," Marco said intensely. "But God help me. I do not want you to—" He leaned closer. His eyes searched hers, frantic and hopeful. The space between them evaporated. Lena's breath quickened, shallow gasps that filled the small cabin. She could feel the warmth of his body radiating toward her, the heat of his breath fanning across her lips. He was going to kiss her. This time, there was no wind, no alleyway distraction, just the two of them in the dark. For a moment, Lena felt herself surrendering. Her hand moved unconsciously, lifting to rest on his chest. Beneath the fine wool of his sweater and the crisp cotton of his shirt, she could feel the solid, heavy thump of his heart. It was beating fast, just as fast as hers. It was a human heart. It was Marco's heart. She leaned in, her eyelids fluttering shut, her lips parting slightly. Then the cold reality crashed down on her. The gun she imagined tucked in his waistband, the men who obeyed his orders, the headlines, the danger that followed him like a shadow, the danger that was currently sitting in a gray sedan somewhere in the city. If she kissed him, she was accepting all of it. If she kissed him, she was stepping into the line of fire. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced the haze of desire. Lena pulled back sharply, gasping as if coming up for air. She scrambled for the door handle, her fingers slipping on the plastic. "I cannot," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "I cannot do this. Marco?" "Lena." He reached for her, but stopped himself. You are the boss of a crime family," she stammered, shoving the door open. The cool night air rushed in, breaking the heated spell of the car. "I cannot be with you, not with who you are now." She stumbled out of the car, slamming the door shut behind her. She did not look back. She ran up the steps to her building, fumbling with her keys, her vision blurred by tears she hadn't realized were falling. Inside the car, Marco sat motionless. His hand was clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white, the leather creaking under the force of his grip. He watched her disappear into the building, the light in the hallway flickering on. His eyes burned with a mixture of frustration and a deep, hollowing longing. He was the most powerful man in the district, capable of commanding armies, yet he was utterly powerless to follow her. 3 days passed, and Lena had not seen Marco DeLuca, not his face, at least, but the city of Harborview, which had once felt like a sprawling, indifferent metropolis, now felt like a small room where he was standing just outside the door. His presence had seeped into the cracks of her life, filling the spaces between her thoughts with a suffocating mix of dread and anticipation. It started with the lilies. They arrived at the Bean Street Cafe on a Tuesday morning, a massive arrangement of white oriental lilies that filled the small shop with their heavy, intoxicating perfume. There was no card tucked between the waxy petals, no signature, just the flowers sitting on the counter like a silent declaration. Tessa had cooed over them, speculating they were from a secret admirer, but Lena knew. She knew because lilies were the only flower Marco had ever bought her, claiming once when they were 17 that roses were a cliché for people without imagination. Then came the car. It was subtle, easy to miss if one was not looking for it, but Lena was looking. Every night when she locked the front door of the cafe and flipped the sign to closed, a black sedan was parked discreetly across the street, tucked into the shadows of the old brick bank building. It was never close enough to be threatening, but always close enough to be seen. It would idle there until she turned the corner toward her apartment, a silent sentinel watching her back. And then there was the incident at the grocery store. A man had started following her down the aisle, making crude comments about her legs. Lena had gripped the handle of her basket, heart hammering, preparing to shout, when a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out from behind a display of apples. She recognized him instantly as one of the guards from the cafe, the one with the shaved head. He did not say a word. He simply looked at the harasser with a flat, dead-eyed stare and adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. The harasser had turned pale, muttered an apology to the air, and practically ran out of the store. Marco was everywhere. He was the shadow on the pavement, the scent of lilies in the air, the invisible shield that separated her from the rest of the world. It was terrifying to be the focus of such power. Yet beneath the fear lay a treacherous warmth. For 10 years, she'd been alone, fighting every battle by herself. Now, a ghost from her past had returned to fight them for her, whether she wanted him to or not. The tension finally snapped on a Friday night. The cafe was busy, filled with the loud chatter of the after-work crowd and the hiss of the espresso machine. Lena was wiping down the counter, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids, when a customer stumbled up to the register. He was a large man, his face flushed with drink, swaying slightly on his feet. "Hey, sweetheart," he slurred, leaning heavily on the counter. "How about you put a little something extra in my coffee?" "We do not serve alcohol here, sir," Lena said, keeping her voice level and professional. "Just coffee and tea." "I'm not talking about alcohol," the man leered, reaching across the counter. His hand shot out and clamped around Lena's wrist. His grip was wet and uncomfortably tight, his fingers digging into her skin. "I am talking about you." He grunted. "You look like you know how to have a good time." Panic flared in Lena's chest. She tried to yank her arm back, but his grip held firm. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice rising. "Let go!" "Do not be like that," the man sneered, pulling her closer so that his sour breath washed over her face. "I'm just being friendly." "Sir, release her immediately," Tessa shouted from the other end of the counter, grabbing the phone to dial for help. But before Tessa could even hit the first button, the air in the cafe shifted. The front door opened, not with a chime, but with a sudden draft of cold air. 2 men in dark jackets materialized on either side of the drunk customer. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized silence. There was no shouting, no dramatic scuffle. One of the men simply placed a hand on the drunk's shoulder, a grip that looked deceptively light but must have been crushing, because the man gasped and his knees buckled. "You are leaving," one of the guards said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. The drunk man's eyes widened as he looked up at the 2 looming figures. The aggression drained out of him instantly, replaced by a primal fear. He released Lena's wrist as if it burned him. I was just leaving," he stammered. The guards escorted him out. They did not drag him, but the force of their presence guided him firmly toward the door and into the night. The entire interaction had taken less than 20 seconds. Lena stood behind the counter, rubbing her wrist, her heart racing like a trapped bird. The cafe had gone silent, the customers staring with wide eyes. Then Marco walked in. He stepped through the door moments after his men had cleared the path. He was not looking at the customers or the room. His eyes were locked on Lena with a laser-like intensity that made her breath hitch. He wore a dark overcoat with the collar turned up, making him look like a storm cloud that had drifted indoors. He walked straight to the counter, bypassing the line, bypassing the register. He stopped directly in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was low, but it carried a vibration of controlled violence that made the hair on her arms stand up. "I am fine," Lena managed to say, though her voice shook. "Just startled." Marco's gaze dropped to her wrist. Even from across the counter, she could see his jaw tighten, the muscle feathering beneath the skin as he clenched his teeth. "Come here," he said. It was not a request. He gestured toward the small, secluded table in the far corner, the one tucked away behind a decorative partition. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, then untied her apron. She signaled to a stunned Tessa that she was taking a break and walked out from behind the counter. Marco led her to the corner and waited for her to sit before pulling up a chair opposite her. He sat close, his knees brushing against hers under the small table. "Give me your hand," he said softly. Lena extended her arm. Marco took her hand in his. His touch was shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to the dangerous aura that surrounded him. His fingers were warm and rough-skinned, holding her wrist as if it were made of spun glass. He inspected the skin where the man had grabbed her. A faint red flush was already forming, the ghost of fingerprints marring her pale skin. Marco stared at the mark. His eyes darkened, shifting from a warm cognac brown to a flat obsidian black. She could see the rage simmering beneath the surface, a cold and lethal thing that terrified her. "He will never touch you again," Marco said. The words were simple, but they sounded like a verdict. "Marco, stop," Lena whispered, pulling her hand back slightly. He tightened his grip just enough to keep her there, his thumb brushing over the pulse point on her wrist. "He was just a drunk. He is gone. Do not do anything." Marco looked up. Meeting her gaze, the darkness in his eyes receded slightly, replaced by a fierce, agonizing protectiveness. "I should have been here 5 minutes earlier. You cannot be everywhere," she said. "I can try," he countered. He ran his thumb over the red mark again, a soothing, repetitive motion. "I hate that he touched you. I hate that I let it happen." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. This was not the Mafia Don speaking. This was the boy who used to walk on the street side of the sidewalk to protect her from splashing cars. The mixture of fear and warmth in her chest swirled together, leaving her dizzy. "I am okay," she insisted softly. "Really?" Marco let out a long breath, releasing her hand but keeping his on the table, inches from hers. "I am walking you home tonight, and I am not accepting no for an answer." Lena looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. She realized she did not want to say no. "Okay," she said. The walk to her apartment was different that night. Marco did not bring the car. He signaled his men to follow at a distance in the vehicle, while he walked beside her on the sidewalk. The night air was crisp, smelling of rain and city exhaust. For the first few blocks, they walked in silence, the rhythm of their footsteps falling into sync as if they had never stopped walking together. "Do you remember the homecoming dance?" Marco asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Lena let out a short, surprised laugh. "The one where you stepped on my foot and broke my heel? I was nervous," Marco defended, a smile touching his lips. It was a real smile this time, reaching his eyes and softening the harsh planes of his face. "You were wearing that blue dress. You looked like something out of a dream. I could not believe you were there with me. I was mad about the shoe," Lena recalled, smiling at the memory. But then you carried me to the car. I would have carried you anywhere, Marco said quietly. The banter flowed easier after that, unlocking a vault of memories they had both kept sealed for a decade. They talked about the nights they used to sneak up to the roof of her old apartment building, sitting on the tar paper and looking at the meager stars that managed to shine through the harbor view smog. "You promised we would run away," Lena said, her voice turning wistful. "You said we would go to California. You would build houses, and I would paint the ocean." Marco stopped walking. They were under the canopy of an old oak tree, the streetlights filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. He looked at her, his expression pained. "I meant it," he said. "Every word. That was the plan. Lena, it was the only plan I ever had." "Plans change?" she whispered. "No," Marco corrected. "Life changes. The plan, the dream, that never changed. I just lost the right to it." The sadness in his voice made her chest ache physically, a sharp pang behind her ribs. She looked at him. The expensive coat, the scar on his jaw, the watchful eyes, and she saw the tragedy of him. He was a king in a kingdom he had never wanted to rule. They reached her apartment building too soon. The black car that had been trailing them pulled to a stop halfway down the block, the engine idling silently. They stood in the small vestibule of her building, the space dimly lit by a flickering overhead bulb. The air between them suddenly felt thick, charged with an electricity that made Lena's skin prickle. "Well," Lena said, turning to face him, "I am safe. You delivered me." "Lena," Marco said. He took a step closer. She fumbled in her purse for her keys, her nerves suddenly jangling. I should go inside." Her fingers, slippery with sweat, grasped the key ring, but as she pulled it out, it slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the tiled floor. "Oh," she breathed. "I got it," Marco said. They both bent down at the same time. Their faces ended up inches apart. Lena froze, her hand hovering over the keys on the floor. Marco was so close she could see the individual lashes framing his dark eyes. She could smell the scent of him. Cedar, rain, and the faint metallic tang of the cold night air. Time seemed to suspend itself. The noise of the city outside, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, faded into a dull buzz. There was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the intensity of his gaze. Marco reached out, his hand covering hers on the floor. He didn't pick up the keys, he just held her hand, his eyes locked on hers. Slowly, they straightened up together. Marco did not step back. Instead, he stepped closer, moving into her personal space until she was pressed back against the cool wood of her apartment door. He raised his arm, bracing his hand against the door frame beside her head. He was not touching her, not really, but he was surrounding her. He was a wall of heat and presence, caging her in with his body. It was a dominant gesture, yet his eyes were pleading. His other hand moved, hovering at her waist, his fingers flexed, as if he wanted to grab her, to pull her against him, but he held back, waiting. Lena felt pinned, not by force, but by the sheer gravity of him. Her back pressed against the hard wood, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct she had to run, to protect herself from the complication of him, was warring with a bone-deep need to be closer. Marco leaned down. His face was so close to hers that his breath fanned across her cheek, warm and enticing. "Lena," he murmured. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of all command, raw with vulnerability. "Can I kiss you?" The directness of the question made her breath hitch in her throat. He could have taken it. He was a man who took what he wanted from the world, but here, in this hallway, he was asking. He was giving her the power. Lena looked at him. She saw the danger. Yes. She saw the scar and the darkness, but she also saw the boy who had carried her when her heel broke. She saw the man who had waited outside her cafe just to see if she was okay. The longing that had been buried under 10 years of hurt and 2 days of fear erupted. She nodded. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible. But Marco saw it. He closed the distance. The kiss began gently. His lips brushed hers with a tentative softness, a question asked and answered in silence. It was a testing of waters, a reacquaintance. His mouth was warm and firm, moving against hers with a careful restraint that made her knees weak. Then, Lena made a sound, a soft, whimpering intake of breath, and her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. That was the spark. Marco groaned low in his throat, his restraint shattered. His hand, which had been hovering at her waist, slammed flat against the small of her back, pulling her flush against his body. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry and fierce. It was 10 years of silence being broken all at once. His mouth moved over hers with a desperate intensity, devouring her. Lena opened to him, her body arching into his, molding against the hard lines of his chest. She could feel the solid muscle beneath his coat, the heat of him seeping through her clothes. Her hands slid up his chest, wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in the short hair at the nape of his neck. They were breathing each other's air, sharing a desperate, breathless embrace that felt like drowning and learning to breathe at the same time. The world narrowed down to the pressure of his lips, the grip of his hand on her waist, and the overwhelming, undeniable truth that she fit here. She fit in his arms. Marco pulled her even closer, his thigh pressing between hers, pinning her against the door. The friction sent a jolt of desire straight to her core. They kissed until their lungs burned, until the edges of Lena's vision began to blur. Finally, Marco broke the kiss. He did not go far. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his chest heaving. His breathing was ragged. Harsh sounds in the quiet hallway. Lena was trembling, her entire body vibrating from the intensity of the connection. "Marco," she whispered, her voice wrecked. He opened his eyes. They were dark, blown wide with desire and a terrified kind of hope. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning off its axis. "I missed you," he rasped. "God, I missed you." Lena pulled back slightly, creating a sliver of space between them. The cold air rushed into the gap, bringing clarity with it. Her lips felt swollen, her heart was racing, and her mind was reeling. The kiss had reawakened everything, the love, the desire, the connection, but it hadn't changed the reality. He was still the dawn. The black car was still waiting outside. Lena stammered, trying to steady her breathing. "I need time. Marco, I cannot just jump back into this. Not with everything that is happening. Not with who you are." Marco's expression tightened, the light in his eyes dimming slightly. But he did not argue. He understood. He nodded slowly. "Take all the time you need," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." He raised his hand and brushed his thumb along her lower lip, tracing the shape of it one last time. It was a possessive, tender gesture that made her shiver. "Good night, Lena," he whispered. He stepped back, the loss of his heat leaving her feeling suddenly cold. He turned and walked out of the vestibule, his coat billowing behind him. Lena watched him get into the waiting black car. It pulled away silently, disappearing into the night. Lena turned and fumbled with her keys again, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock her door. She stumbled into her apartment and locked the deadbolt behind her, leaning back against the door as she slid down to the floor. Later that night, the apartment was quiet. Lena sat on her couch, her knees pulled up to her chest. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window across the room. She raised a hand to touch her lips. They still tingled. "I love him," she whispered to the empty room. The admission hung in the air, undeniable and terrifying. "I still love him." Behind her, the television was playing the late-night news on mute. A flash of red breaking news banner caught her eye. She turned to look at the screen. The anchor was speaking solemnly, and behind her was a photo. It was a blurry, surveillance-style image. But Lena recognized the subject immediately. It was Marco, entering a warehouse down by the docks. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen in stark white letters. "Police launch. New investigation into DeLuca crime family racketeering charges. Indictments expected imminently." Lena stared at the screen. at the grainy image of the man whose taste was still on her lips. The love she had just admitted to felt heavy in her chest, a lead weight dragging her down. She loved him. Yes, but the news anchor's serious expression was a cold reminder that loving Marco DeLuca was not a fairy tale. It was walking straight into the line of fire. The atmosphere in Harborview had shifted. It was no longer just the rain slicking the cobblestones or the fog rolling off the bay. The air itself felt tighter, compressed by an invisible weight. In the days following the incident with the drunk customer, the neighborhood around Bean Street Cafe seemed to hold its breath. Lena noticed the changes immediately. It started with the cars. Plain, American-made sedans in nondescript colors, gray, tan, navy, began parking in loading zones and no parking spots that usually guaranteed a ticket within 10 minutes. They sat there for hours, engines idling, windows tinted just enough to obscure the faces inside. Then came the questions. Uniformed officers, who used to stop by for a quick donut and a friendly wave, were replaced by men in ill-fitting suits who ordered black coffee and nursed it for 40 minutes, their eyes tracking every person who walked through the door. They asked Tessa about the delivery trucks. They asked the bakery owner next door about foot traffic late at night. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose. On a Wednesday afternoon, while Lena was wiping down the outdoor tables, a man approached her. He wore a beige trench coat that looked like a relic from a detective movie, but his eyes were sharp, modern, and devoid of humor. He flashed a badge that identified him as Detective Harris. "Miss Carter?" he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Can I help you?" "Detective?" Lena asked, clutching her rag tighter. "I hope so," Harris said, leaning against the wrought iron railing. "You've been spending a lot of time with Marco DeLuca lately." Lena's stomach dropped. "I do not see how my personal life is police business." "It becomes our business when your personal life involves the head of an organized crime syndicate, Mo," Harris replied smoothly. He watched her face carefully, looking for a crack. "Marco is a dangerous man. Lena, can I call you Lena? He has enemies, and right now the department is taking a very close look at his operations. When we make our move, and we will make a move, anyone standing too close to him is going to get hit by the shrapnel." "Is that a threat?" Lena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is a friendly warning," Harris said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "Or maybe an opportunity. A girl like you, clean record artist. You could be a victim in this, or you could be valuable. If you see anything, hear anything, you give me a call. Before you get dragged down with him." He placed a business card on the table, tapped it once with his index finger, and walked away. Lena stared at the white rectangle of cardstock as if it were radioactive, valuable. The word echoed in her mind, sickening and cold. That evening, Marco picked her up. He did not come to the cafe door. Instead, he texted her a location near the river, a secluded spot under the old steel bridge where the city lights reflected on the black water like shattered gold. When Lena arrived, Marco was leaning against the railing, staring out at the harbor. He looked tired. The crisp lines of his suit seemed to weigh heavily on him. His shoulders slumped in a rare moment of unguarded exhaustion. "They approached me today," Lena said, not bothering with a greeting. Marco stiffened, but he did not turn around immediately. "Who?" "A Detective Harris," she said, walking up to stand beside him. "He told me that standing next to you is a good way to get hurt. He told me I could be valuable to them." Marco turned then, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "He spoke to you? He threatened you?" "He hinted," Lena said, "but that is not the point. Marco, the point is that he is right. I am in the middle of something I do not understand. I am tired of the shadows. I am tired of the rumors. I want the truth." Marco looked away, watching a barge drift slowly down the river. "The truth is ugly." "Lena, I do not care," she snapped. "I deserve to know. If I am going to have police detectives cornering me at work, I need to know what you actually do. Not the sanitized version. The truth." Marco exhaled a long breath, the sound lost in the wind coming off the water. He turned back to her, his eyes dark and serious. "I run numbers," he said, his voice flat. illegal gambling, high-stakes poker, sports betting. I take a percentage of every pot in the city. I run protection for the businesses in the district. They pay me. And I make sure nobody like the Valdezes or the Russians smashes their windows. I smuggle luxury goods, watches, electronics, designer clothes through the port without paying customs duties. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river breeze. Hearing him say it, listing the crimes like a grocery list, made it real in a way the headlines never had. "Is that it?" she asked quietly. "I do not touch drugs," Marco said, his voice gaining a hard, defiant edge. "And I do not touch trafficking. My father, he was starting to look into it before he got sick, but I shut it down. I keep the poison out of Harborview. I keep the violence between the families. I do not let it spill onto the sidewalks." "You sound like you think you are noble," Lena said, shaking her head. "Marco, you are a criminal. You are extorting people. You are breaking the law." "I am bringing order to chaos," Marco argued, stepping closer. "If I step down, do you think the crime stops? No. The Valdezes move in, and they do not care about collateral damage. They sell heroin to kids. They burn down shops that miss a payment. I am the dam holding back the flood." "Lena, or maybe you are just part of the water," she countered. The rationalization disturbed her, but beneath the revulsion, there was a treacherous flicker of reassurance. He had lines he would not cross. He was a bad man, perhaps, but he was not a monster. "Why are you here, Marco?" she asked, the question bursting out of her. "Why are you dragging me into this? Is it because I am the only person left who remembers you before you were this? Am I just a distraction for you? A little piece of nostalgia to make you feel better about yourself?" Marco recoiled as if she had slapped him. The hurt in his eyes was instant and raw. "Is that what you think?" "What else am I supposed to think?" Lena cried, throwing her hands up. "You left me. You left me for 10 years without a word, and now you come back and expect me to just accept this life? You walked away. Marco, you chose this over me." "I never chose this over you," Marco roared. The sound of his voice, raw and thundering, silenced the night. Even the traffic on the bridge above seemed to quiet down. Marco was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his composure shattered. "My father," he said, his voice cracking, dropping to a harsh whisper. "My father found out about us. He found out I was planning to leave with you. He told me that if I tried to run, if I tried to take you away from Harborview, he would have you killed." Lena froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" "He meant it, Lena," Marco said, his voice thick with the memory of that terror. "He showed me photos. Photos of you walking to school. Photos of you in your bedroom. He had been watching you. He said the only way you stayed alive was if I came to work for him, alone. I had to break your heart to save your life." Lena stared at him, the air leaving her lungs. All the years of anger, the nights spent wondering what she had done wrong, the belief that she hadn't been enough to make him stay, it all crumbled into dust. He hadn't left because he didn't love her. He had left because he loved her too much to risk her. A sob clawed its way up her throat. She was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. Horror at what his father had done, anger at Marco for carrying this burden alone, and a profound, aching gratitude that brought her to her knees. She turned away, unable to look at him, her hands covering her mouth. She started to walk, just to move, just to process the sheer weight of the revelation. "Lena," Marco called out. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. It was not a harsh grip, but it was firm, desperate. He pulled her back toward him. She spun around and their bodies collided. Marco steadied her, his hands coming up to grip her upper arms, holding her upright when her knees felt like water. They stood there in the shadows of the bridge, the revelation hanging between them like a physical thing. The air was charged, crackling with the energy of 10 years of silence, finally being broken. Lena looked up at him. She saw the boy who had sacrificed his soul to keep her safe. She saw the man who had lived in hell so she could walk in the sunlight. The argument died in her throat. She reached up, her hands clutching the lapels of his coat, and pulled him down. Marco did not hesitate. He crashed his mouth onto hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It It was fierce, hungry, and unrestrained. It was a kiss of desperation, of two people who had been starving for each other for a decade. Lena opened her mouth to him, tasting the salt of tears, hers or his, she did not know, and the darkness that he carried. Marco's hands slid from her arms down to her waist, then lower, pressing his palms against the small of her back. He pulled her flush against him, crushing her to his chest as if he were trying to merge their bodies into one. Lena gasped into his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair. Knocking his expensive sunglasses to the pavement, neither of them cared. The city lights shimmered on the water behind them, a kaleidoscope of gold and neon. But Lena saw only the darkness behind her closed eyelids. She felt the rough texture of his jacket, the heat of his skin, the frantic rhythm of his heart beating against hers. It was a release of pressure that had been building since she was 18 years old. When they finally broke apart, they were both gasping for air. Lena rested her forehead against his chest, her legs trembling so hard she wasn't sure she could stand on her own. Marco wrapped his arms fully around her, enveloping her in a protective embrace that blocked out the wind, the river, and the city. He splayed his hands over her back, holding her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her like she was the only anchor keeping him from drifting out to sea. In that embrace, Lena felt cherished in a way she never had before, but she also felt the weight of his world pressing in on her. She was safe in his arms, but she was also trapped in the storm that surrounded him. "Let me take you home," Marco whispered into her hair. They walked back to the car in silence, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of shared knowledge, of a bond reforged in fire. When they reached her apartment, Marco did not leave at the door. He walked inside with her, locking the world out behind them. They sat on her small, worn couch, the only light coming from a street lamp outside the window. They did not do anything more than sit. Lena sat close to him, her legs tucked up and brushing against his thigh. Marco had discarded his jacket, his tie loosened, looking more human than the crime boss she had seen on the news. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers, his thumb rubbing slow circles on her skin. She leaned her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. "If you could," Lena asked softly, breaking the quiet, "if you could go anywhere, where would we go?" Marco rested his cheek against her hair. "Vermont," he said instantly. "Or maybe Maine. Somewhere with trees, somewhere quiet. A small house," Lena murmured, closing her eyes. "With a porch. And a workshop for you," Marco added, "with big windows facing north for the light. And a dog," Lena said. "A big, goofy dog that does not know how to bark." "Sounds perfect," Marco whispered. They sat there for a long time, building a life out of words, constructing a fragile dream of normalcy in the middle of a war zone. It felt real, painfully real, even though they both knew that outside that door. The wolves were waiting. The reality crashed back in the next day. Lena woke up alone. Marco had left before dawn, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "Stay safe, I will call you." But the call did not come. The morning news was filled with reports of a fire at a nightclub downtown, the Blue Velvet, one of the establishments rumored to belong to the DeLuca family. The reporters spoke of a rival gang making a move, of a turf war escalating into open violence. Lena spent the day at the cafe in a state of spiraling anxiety. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped, but it was never him. She texted him once, then twice. "Are you okay?" No answer. The hours dragged by like lead weights. The police presence on the street was heavier than ever, sirens wailing in the distance every 20 minutes. Lena served coffee and smiled at customers, but inside, she was screaming. She kept seeing the image of the burning club, imagining Marco inside, imagining the police closing in. By the time she got home that night, her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She paced her small living room, the TV playing low in the background, her phone clutched in her hand. It was nearly 2 a.m. when a soft knock sounded at her door. Lena flew across the room and through the deadbolt. She yanked the door open. Marco stood there. He looked wrecked. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with soot and something dark that might have been dried blood. His hair was messy, and a dark, ugly bruise was blooming across his left cheekbone, swelling the skin around his eye. "Marco," Lena breathed, her heart seizing. He stepped inside, and she immediately locked the door behind him. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment as if just standing upright required immense effort. Lena reached for him, her hands trembling. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the angry edge of the bruise on his cheek. He winced slightly but did not pull away. "You are hurt," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "The club. I saw on the news. Retaliation," Marco rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "They hit us. I had to hit back." Fear and anger warred in her chest. "You could have been killed. You did not call. I thought—" Marco opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, filled with an exhaustion that went down to his bones. He caught her hand as it lingered on his cheek. He turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss into the center of her hand. He closed his eyes again, breathing in her scent, as if he were trying to absorb strength from her skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her palm. "I did not want you to worry." "How can I not worry?" Lena asked, her voice breaking. "Look at you, Marco." He lowered her hand, holding it tightly in his own. He looked at her with a stark, terrifying clarity. "I do not know what to do," he admitted, his voice a rough whisper that terrified her more than any shout could have. "The walls are closing in. Lena, the feds, the Valdezes. Everyone is moving at once." He squeezed her hand, his gaze intense and desperate. "I do not know how much longer I can keep you safe," he said. "Not if you stay close to me. I am drowning, Lena, and I am terrified I am going to pull you down with me." The silence was heavier than the sirens. For 3 days, Marco's presence in Lena's life had been reduced to a ghost-like absence. The black sedan across the street was gone, replaced by the empty, rain-slicked pavement. His texts, which had once been frequent if brief, had dwindled to single-word answers or hours of radio silence. When she called, it went straight to voicemail. He was pulling away. Lena felt it in her bones, a cold ache that was different from the sharp pain of his disappearance 10 years ago. That had been a sudden amputation. This was a slow, deliberate starvation. She knew why he was doing it. The news reports were getting worse, indictments handing down, raids on warehouses, the net tightening around the DeLuca organization. He was trying to cut her loose before the ship went down. But knowing the reason did not stop the feeling of abandonment from clawing at her chest. It was amidst this suffocating silence that Detective Harris returned. He came to the cafe just as the morning rush was dying down. He didn't order coffee this time. He simply waited until Lena was clearing a table near the window and stepped into her path. "Miss Carter," Harris said. His voice was devoid of the faux friendliness he had used before. He looked tired, his tie loosened, a man running out of patience. "Detective," Lena said, clutching a stack of dirty saucers. "I have nothing to tell you." "I think you do," Harris said, lowering his voice. "And I think you're running out of time to tell it. We're moving on Marco. Lena, it is not a matter of if anymore. It is a matter of when. And when we do, it is going to be violent." Lena stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know you are not one of them," Harris said. He leaned in, his eyes hard and urgent. "Help us, Lena. I am not asking you to wear a wire. I am not asking you to testify in open court. Just tell us what you notice. Who is coming and going? Where is he sleeping? If you give us enough to understand his movements, we can bring him in quietly. We can minimize the crossfire." "You want me to spy on him," Lena said, the words tasting like ash. "I want to save lives," Harris countered. "Maybe even his, if he cooperates, if he comes in on his own terms because we get to him first. We can help him. We can offer protection. But if the rival families get to him before we do, or if he goes down fighting in a raid, there is no deal. There is just a body bag." He let the image hang in the air between them. "Think about it," Harris said, stepping back. "For his sake." The rest of the day was a blur of anxiety. The thought of betraying Marco made Lena physically ill, a twisting nausea in her gut, but the detective's words had planted a seed of terror that grew with every hour Marco didn't call. A body bag. She could not lose him again. Not to prison. Not to death. That night, Lena did not go home. She went to the one place she knew Marco went when the world became too loud, the old rooftop of the tenement building where he had grown up, a building he still owned but kept vacant. It was a guess, a desperate gamble. But when she pushed open the heavy steel door to the roof, she saw him. He was standing at the edge, looking out over the glittering sprawl of harbor view. He wore a dark coat, the collar turned up against the wind. He looked like a statue carved from solitude. "Marco," she said. He spun around, his hand flying to his waist by instinct before he recognized her. His hand dropped, but his shoulders remained tense. "You should not be here, Lena," he said. His voice was cold, a rasp of steel. "I told you it is not safe." "I do not care about safe," Lena said, walking across the gravel roof toward him. "I care about you. You are shutting me out. I am protecting you," he snapped. "There is a difference." "Is there?" she challenged, stopping a few feet away. "Because it feels like you are just waiting to die, and you do not want me to watch." Marco flinched. The mask of the dawn slipped, revealing the exhausted man beneath. "Harris came to see me today," Lena said. Marco went still. The air around him turned dangerous. "What did you say to him?" "He offered a deal," Lena said, her voice shaking. "He said if I help them, if you cooperate, they can protect you." "Get out!" Marco snarled. He turned away from her, gripping the parapet wall until his knuckles turned white. "You are talking about ratting, Lena. You are talking about betraying everything. I am talking about staying alive," Lena shouted to the wind. She moved closer, grabbing his arm and forcing him to look at her. "Marco, look at me. They are coming for you. The Valdezes are coming. The police are coming. You are alone. You cannot fight the whole world." "I have to," Marco shouted back. But as he looked at her, the anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving him hollowed out. He slumped. It was a terrifying sight. Marco DeLuca, who always stood as if he carried the sky on his shoulders, simply folded. His shoulders dropped, his head bowed, and he sank down onto a rusted metal bench near the chimney stack. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. "I'm so tired." "Lena," he whispered. The sound was broken, muffled by his palms. "I am just so tired." Lena's heart broke. She sat down beside him, ignoring the grit and the cold. She placed a hand on his back, through the thick wool of his coat. She could feel the tension vibrating in his muscles. "I am tired of the blood," Marco confessed, his voice barely audible. "I'm tired of looking over my shoulder every time I walk out a door. I'm tired of wondering which one of my men is going to put a bullet in the back of my head for a payout." He lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He looked at her with a vulnerability that stripped him naked. "But mostly," he said, his voice cracking, "I am tired of this, of wanting to hold you and knowing that every time I touch you, I am painting a target on your back. The feds. They sent word. They are not just looking at me. They are looking at my cousin, Leo. He's 19. Lena, he has nothing to do with this. But they are going to bury him just to get to me." "Then stop," Lena whispered. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumbs brushing against the rough stubble on his cheeks. "Stop fighting. Let it go." Marco looked at her, searching her face as if it were a map to a place he had lost long ago. The desperation in his eyes softened into something else, something deep, aching and overwhelmingly tender. "I do not know how to be anything else," he murmured. "I do," Lena said. The intensity of the moment drew them together like magnets. Marco leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. When he opened them again, his gaze dropped to her lips. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger or desperation this time. It was a kiss of surrender. It was deep, slow, and unguarded. Marco's lips moved against hers with a reverence that made her breath catch. He tasted of grief and longing. Lena's body turned toward him as if pulled by gravity. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. Marco groaned low in his throat, his arms coming around her waist to pull her onto his lap. The rooftop faded away. The sirens in the distance faded away. There was only the heat of him, the solid reality of his body against hers. They did not go home. They went to the small maintenance room on the roof, a tiny space with a single dusty window and an old couch Marco must have kept there for nights he couldn't face the empty penthouse. The hours that followed were a slow, deliberate study of each other. It was not about a frantic rush to the finish line. It was about memorizing. They lay on the narrow couch, fully clothed, wrapped in an old wool blanket Marco had pulled from a cupboard. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the grime of the window. Marco's hand traced the line of Lena's jaw, his fingers feather-light. He explored the curve of her ear, the pulse beating in her neck, the slope of her shoulder. He touched her as if he were blind and trying to learn her shape by feel alone. "You have a freckle here," he whispered, touching a spot just below her collarbone. "You have a scar here," Lena replied, her fingertips tracing a jagged white line on his forearm, exposing the skin where his sleeve was rolled up. "And here." She traced another mark on his wrist. Marco watched her hand, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Bar fight," he murmured. "Chicago." "And this one?" she asked, touching a small burn mark. "Mistake," he said. "A lesson." He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles one by one. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. It felt heavier, more significant than anything physical they could have done. It felt like a goodbye, and it felt like a beginning. They lay there for hours, whispering words that had no place in the daylight. They talked about the past, about the 10 years lost. They talked about the things they regretted. They held each other with a fierce, quiet desperation, terrified that if they let go, the world would rush in and tear them apart. Eventually, the exhaustion overtook them. Lena curled up against him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Marco wrapped both arms around her, burying his face in her hair. He fell asleep like that, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. When Lena woke, sunlight was filtering through the dusty window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the air. She didn't move. She lay there, watching Marco sleep. In the soft morning light, the hard lines of his face were smoothed out. The furrow between his brows was gone. He looked younger. He looked like the boy she had loved when she was 18. A fierce resolve settled in her chest. She would not let him die. She would not let him rot in a cell. Marco stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a second he looked confused, and then his gaze landed on her, and the warmth that flooded his expression made her heart ache. "Morning," he rasped. "Morning," Lena whispered. They shared a quiet, lingering kiss, their foreheads pressed together. "Talk to Harris," Lena said against his lips. "Talk to them. Marco, do it for Leo. Do it for us." Marco pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. The struggle was visible on his face, the lifetime of code, of loyalty, warring with the reality of his situation. "If I do this," he said slowly, "there is no going back. The family, they will kill me if they can. I will be a traitor. You will be alive," Lena said firmly. "We can start over, somewhere else, somewhere with trees." Marco let out a long, shuddering breath. He nodded. "Okay, only if they guarantee safety for Leo and immunity for me, a witness protection deal. We will make them agree," Lena promised. The next 2 days were a blur of high-stakes tension. Marco met secretly with Detective Harris and a team of federal agents in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. Lena waited in the car, watching the perimeter, her nerves frayed to wires. Marco offered them everything. He gave them the locations of the warehouses. He gave them the names of the corrupt port officials. He gave them the structure of the Valdez operation, information he had gathered for his own protection. In exchange, he demanded total exoneration and new identities for himself. Lena, and his cousin Leo. The feds were eager, too eager. They pushed for more, for names of his own captains, for the inner circle. Marco gave them enough to cripple the organization but tried to protect the men he knew were just following orders. But secrets in Harborview were like water in a sieve. They always leaked. It started with small things. When Lena went to the cafe, the regular customers were quiet. The friendly nods from the neighborhood shopkeepers were gone, replaced by averted eyes. Then, the faces changed. Unfamiliar men began appearing on the street corners near Bean Street Cafe. They were not Marco's men. They were harder, their eyes shifting nervously. And when Marco's own guards came by, they looked at Marco differently. There was no longer the deferential dip of the head. There was suspicion. There was a question in their eyes. Is it true? Is he talking? Something is wrong, Marco told her on the third night. He was pacing her living room, checking the window every few minutes. The chatter has gone dead. My captains are not answering. Someone talked. Someone knows I am meeting with the feds. We just need a few more days, Lena said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. The paperwork is almost done. Then we leave. A few days is a lifetime, Marco muttered. The next evening, Lena was closing the cafe alone. Tessa had gone home early with a migraine. The street outside was dark, a heavy fog rolling in off the harbor, obscuring the streetlights. Lena locked the front door, turning the key with a loud click. She checked her phone. She had a text from Marco. I am coming to get you. Pack a bag. We are moving tonight. Relief washed over her. Tonight, it was ending tonight. She started to type a reply. I am ready. I love you. She stepped off the curb to cross the street. A van screeched around the corner. It was gray, battered, with no license plates. It mounted the curb, cutting off her path. Lena froze. The side door slid open with a violent metallic rasp. Two men jumped out. They wore ski masks, but Lena recognized the tattoos on the neck of one of them, a spider web design. She had seen it on one of Marco's own lieutenants. Betrayal. Hey, Lena shouted, backing up. Get away! A third man jumped out, this one wearing the colors of the Valdez cartel. It was a joint strike, Marco's traitor and his enemy, united by a common target. Grab her, the lieutenant shouted. Lena turned to run, but they were too fast. Rough hands grabbed her arms, yanking her backwards. She screamed, kicking out, but a hand clamped over her mouth, smelling of gasoline and tobacco. Shut her up, the Valdez man growled. They dragged her toward the open maw of the van. Lena fought with everything she had, scratching at the hands, twisting her body, but she was lifted off her feet and thrown into the dark interior. The door slammed shut, sealing her in darkness. The van peeled away, tires smoking against the pavement, on the street. Lena's phone lay where it had fallen from her hand. The screen was shattered, a spider web of cracks obscuring the glowing text message that would never be sent. I am ready. I love you. The shattered screen of Lena's phone was the last image burned into Marco's mind before the world tilted on its axis. He stood in the middle of his living room, the silence of the penthouse deafening, his own phone pressed to his ear. They took her. Tessa's voice sobbed on the other end, hysterical and broken. A van, gray, men in masks. I called the police, but Marco... They took her. Marco lowered the phone, ending the call without a word. His hand was trembling. It was a tremor that started in his fingers and radiated up his arm, a physical manifestation of a terror he had never felt before. He had faced guns, knives, and the prospect of prison without flinching. But this was different. This was Lena. His burner phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from an unknown number. We know you are singing to the feds. We have the girl, the old warehouse on Pier 42. Come alone. If we see a single cop, she dies. If you are not here in 30 minutes, she dies. Marco stared at the message. The Valdezes. And someone from his own inner circle had sold him out, leaking the meetings with Detective Harris. He grabbed his keys and his coat. He checked the clip in his handgun. His movements automatic, robotic. He had a choice to make. The feds were watching him. They were expecting him to check in. If he went rogue, the deal was off. If he went alone, he was walking into a firing squad. But if he waited for backup, Lena could be dead before they even breached the door. He dialed Harris. "DeLuca?" The detective answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" "They have her," Marco said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a mixer. "Pier 42. I am going in." "Do not do it, Marco," Harris barked. "It is a trap. We can mobilize a tactical team, but we need time to set a perimeter. If you go in there alone, you are a dead man." "I am dead anyway if she gets hurt," Marco said. "I am going in the front door. I will buy you time. You set up your perimeter, but do not breach until I give the signal. If they see a badge before I have eyes on her, I will kill you myself." He hung up and threw the phone against the wall. The drive to the docks was a blur of wet asphalt and red lights ran at 90 miles an hour. Marco parked the car a block away from the pier, in the shadow of a rusted crane. The air smelled of salt, rot, and gasoline. He walked toward the warehouse. It was a cavernous, corrugated metal structure that loomed against the night sky like a beast. The large sliding door was cracked open, spilling a sliver of yellow light onto the wet concrete. Marco raised his hands, showing he was unarmed, though the gun was tucked into the waistband of his back, a cold comfort against his spine. He stepped into the light. "I am here," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high metal ceiling. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shipping crates and shadows. In the center, under a swaying industrial light, sat a wooden chair. Lena was tied to it. Her mouth was gagged with a strip of cloth, her hair messy and falling over her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that cut Marco to the bone. But she was alive. She was unbroken. As he stepped forward, 3 men stepped out from behind the crates. 2 were Valdez soldiers, holding automatic rifles. The third was the man Marco had trusted with his life, his lieutenant, Russo. "You look surprised, boss," Russo sneered, leveling a pistol at Marco's chest. "I am not surprised," Marco said, his eyes never leaving Lena's face. "I am just disappointed." "Get on your knees," the Valdez leader ordered. He was a thick-set man with a scar running through his eyebrow. He walked over to Lena, resting a heavy hand on her shoulder. Lena flinched violently, a muffled cry escaping the gag. Marco dropped to his knees on the concrete. The impact jarred his teeth, but he did not look away. "Let her go," he said. "You have me. I am the one who talked. I am the one you want. Let her walk out of here, and I will not fight you." "You are in no position to bargain," the Valdez leader laughed. "You sold us out to the law. You broke the code, Marco. And now you are going to watch your little girlfriend bleed for it." He pressed the barrel of his gun against Lena's temple. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out and tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She was shaking, her chest heaving against the ropes. "Please," Marco said. The word hung in the silence. Marco DeLuca, who had never begged for anything in his life, who had stared down death 100 times with a sneer, bowed his head. "Please," he repeated, his voice cracking. "Do whatever you want of me. Cut me up. Burn me. I do not care. But she is innocent. She has nothing to do with this life." He looked up, tears of desperation shining in his eyes. "She is the only good thing I have ever had," he choked out. "Do not take her. Please, do not take her." Russo laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Look at him! The king of Harborview, crying like a baby. He is stalling," the Valdez leader growled. He cocked the hammer of his gun. At that moment, a sound came from the roof, the scrape of a boot on metal. One of the Valdez soldiers panicked. He spun around, firing a burst of bullets toward the ceiling. "We are compromised! Feds!" Russo screamed. The warehouse exploded into chaos. The windows high above shattered as tear gas canisters rained down. Hissing and spewing white smoke, the heavy thud of a battering ram hit the side doors. "Kill him!" the leader shouted. Turning his gun toward Marco, Marco moved. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't run for the exit. He launched himself forward, sprinting toward Lena. Gunfire erupted from all sides. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of thunder trapped in a tin can. Marco saw the muzzle flash from Russo's gun. He felt a white-hot impact in his left shoulder, like a sledgehammer strike, spinning him around. "Marco!" Lena screamed, the gag having slipped down in her struggle. He stumbled. his vision graying at the edges, blood immediately soaking his shirt, but he did not stop. He scrambled back to his feet, adrenaline overriding the pain. He reached Lena just as the Valdez leader turned his weapon back toward her. Marco tackled the chair, knocking Lena and the chair over behind a stack of wooden pallets, just as bullets chewed up the concrete where they had been. Marco scrambled over her, using his body as a shield. His good hand fumbled with the knots at her wrists. His fingers were slick with sweat and blood, shaking uncontrollably. "I have got you!" he gasped, his face inches from hers. "I have got you! Lena!" Lena was sobbing, her eyes locked on his bleeding shoulder. "You are shot, Marco, you are shot. It is nothing," he lied, gritting his teeth as he yanked the rope free. Lena's hands came free. She didn't reach for safety. She reached for him. She grabbed his face, her hands trembling, smearing a streak of his own blood on his cheek. "Do not you die," she fiercely whispered. "Do not you dare die on me." Around them, the warehouse was a war zone. SWAT teams were shouting commands, boots stomping on concrete, the staccato rhythm of gunfire echoing. But behind the pallets, in the eye of the storm, time compressed. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, consuming love. "I'm sorry," he breathed. "I'm so sorry I brought you here." "Shut up," Lena sobbed. She pulled him down. Their mouths met in a kiss that tasted of salt, tears, and iron. It was messy and desperate, a collision of two souls trying to anchor each other in the middle of a hurricane. Marco winced as his shoulder throbbed, but he kissed her back with everything he had left, pouring every ounce of his regret and his hope into her. "Clear! Room clear!" a voice bellowed from the smoke. The gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groans of the injured and the metallic click of handcuffs. Marco broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. "It is over," he whispered. "Lena, it is over." Moments later, strong hands pulled them apart. A medic was checking Marco's shoulder, cutting away his shirt. Detective Harris stood over them, looking grim but relieved. "You are lucky, DeLuca," Harris said, holstering his weapon. "The bullet went through. No bone." Marco didn't look at the detective. He looked at Lena, who was being wrapped in a shock blanket by an officer. She refused to leave the spot, her eyes glued to him. "The deal?" Marco asked, wincing as the medic pressed gauze to his wound. "It holds," Harris said. "Russo and the Valdez head are in custody. You gave us the kingdom. Marco, we will keep our end." Officers hauled Marco to his feet. He was cuffed, his hands secured behind his back. As they began to lead him toward the waiting police cruisers, he turned his head. "Lena!" She broke away from the officer trying to guide her to an ambulance. She ran to him, the orange blanket fluttering behind her like a cape. She stopped right in front of him, heedless of the police, the blood, and the flashing lights. She reached up and cupped his face again. Marco leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "I will wait," she whispered, her voice fierce and steady. "Do you hear me? I will wait. You do the time. You get out. You keep choosing the right path, and I will be there." Marco opened his eyes. They were clear, unburdened for the first time in years. "I promise," he said. She pressed a trembling kiss to his lips, right there in front of the cops and the wreckage of his former life. It was a seal, a vow. Then they led him away. Marco did not look back at the warehouse. He kept his eyes fixed on her until the cruiser door slammed shut, separating them, but not breaking them. 18 months later. The bell above the door of the canvas bean chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that cut through the soft jazz playing on the speakers. Lena looked up from the espresso machine. The shop was small, much smaller than the old cafe, but it was hers. Her watercolors lined the brick walls, seascapes, city skylines, and one detailed sketch of a boy and a girl sitting on a rooftop. The morning light poured in through the big north-facing window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A man was standing in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered. The expensive, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple gray button-down shirt and dark canvas trousers. His hair was a little longer, softer. The tension that used to coil in his shoulders, the constant readiness for violence, was gone. Marco. He stood there, hesitating, his hands gripping the strap of a messenger bag. He looked unsure of his welcome, like a traveler returning to a home he wasn't sure still existed. Lena's heart did a slow, heavy somersault in her chest. She wiped her hands on her apron, bypassing the counter entirely. "Hi," she said, her voice breathy. "Hi," Marco replied. His voice was the same, that low rumble that vibrated in her bones, but the edge was gone. He walked further into the shop. "Nice place," he said, looking around. "Good light." "I took your advice," Lena said, smiling through the sudden sting of tears. "North-facing windows." They stood awkwardly for a moment, the weight of the last year and a half hanging between them. The court dates, the prison visits through glass, the letters. "I am out," Marco said, as if she didn't know. "Supervised release, I got a job, construction, nothing fancy, just framing houses out in the suburbs. It is honest work." "That sounds good," Lena said. "Really good. I am seeing someone," Marco blurted out. Lena froze, her stomach dropping. "Oh, a therapist," Marco corrected quickly, a flash of panic in his eyes. "Doctor Evans, twice a week. We talk about everything. The nightmares are getting better. Not gone, but better." Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, watery and relieved. "I am glad. Marco?" She gestured to the small table by the window. "Do you want to sit? I can make you a coffee. Dark roast? Black?" "Please," he said. They sat at the table as the afternoon sun began to dip lower, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. They talked. Not about the Valdezes or the feds or the lost years. They talked about his new job, about the smell of sawdust, about her latest commission for a children's book. It was shy at first, tentative. They were relearning each other, navigating the new shapes of their lives. But beneath the small talk, the current was still there, stronger, deeper and cleaner than before. Lena reached across the table. She threaded her fingers through his. Marco stopped speaking mid-sentence. He looked down at their joined hands. His thumb moved, stroking the back of her hand gently, reverently. He treated her hand like it was something fragile and precious, something he had been given stewardship over and would defend with his life, not with violence this time, but with care. "I did not know if you would really wait," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. "I told you I would," Lena said firmly. "I do not break my promises." Marco looked up. The love in his eyes was so open, so unguarded. It took her breath away. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this." "You already do," she said. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street outside. Lena stood up and flipped the sign on the door to closed. "Walk me home?" she asked. They stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was cool and crisp, smelling of autumn leaves. There were no black sedans waiting, no bodyguards, just the ordinary traffic of a city moving on. Marco turned to her. He didn't ask this time. He simply wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close. It wasn't a desperate clutch for survival. It was a steady, grounding embrace. Lena rested her head against his chest. She listened. Thump, 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 thump. His heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. Marco tilted her chin up with one finger. The golden light of the street lamp above them caught the gold flecks in his eyes. "I love you," he said. "Just Marco. Just me." "I love you," Lena whispered back. "Just you." He lowered his head. The kiss was slow and tender. It held no urgency, no fear of imminent danger. It was soft and lingering, tasting of coffee and hope. It was a promise made not in the dark, but in the light. They broke apart but didn't let go. Marco took her hand, interlacing their fingers. They turned and walked down the street together, two silhouettes framed by the warm glow of the cafe, stepping away from the shadows and into the quiet, beautiful ordinary of a normal life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey writing Lena and Marco's story with you, from the first tense moment in the cafe to this final, peaceful walk home. I hope you enjoyed the twists, the turns, and the emotional roller coaster of their romance. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? Please drop a comment below and let me know which part of the story was your favorite. And if you enjoyed this, please make sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories and share your thoughts in English. Your support means the world and helps us bring more stories like this to life. Until next time, keep reading and keep believing in second chances.